It was once believed that a very frail man by the name of Duran von Spring wanted to start a sawmill. He knew nothing about the lumber industry. He barely knew how to chop a tree down. But he knew that the wealthiest man in town married the prettiest woman he ever saw. And that man, well, he ran a sawmill. So Duran did as much research as he could before asking around. Some of the guys who worked for the richest man suggested he go into the woods and chop down a tree just to get a feel for the job, and they laughed at his frail physique, expecting him to return to them with failure written all over his face. And Duran wasn't one to stop any plan he believed in, so he went into the woods to chop down a tree alone. Being a lumberjack isn't exactly a job to do by oneself, but Duran desperately wanted to get things rolling. He picked a small enough tree that he was sure he could handle, and with his axe, he hacked away. Teasing came incessantly when Duran returned with his small tree. His moment of triumph turned into a moment of failure. No one could celebrate how great his achievement was, and it infuriated him. So Duran returned to the woods, this time seeking out the tallest tree. He found one that was perfect and spent hours with his axe and saw cutting a wedge out of the base for it to fall exactly where he needed it to. The sound of its bark snapping and its branches hitting other trees on the way down echoed loudly around Duran. With his axe in hand, he was determined to show everyone he knew what he wanted and how to get it. He chopped off the tip of the tree, and it had to weigh a few 100 pounds, even though it was just the tip. But he needed everyone to know. Duran lassoed the log and then fashioned a harness around his body to drag it back. All through the woods, the dragging log tore through grass and leaves, digging a trail in the dirt. A deep breath in and a slow one out, with noises of strain emitting from his body as he dragged that log. He stopped. He breathed. He dragged. And he repeated. Now there are many things that live in the woods of Washington. And that Duran failed to remember was that everything wasn't as friendly as he. In his distraction and focus of dragging the log, he ignored the tingling sensation of tiny legs crawling on his skin. Shaking his body while he continued to walk, he tried desperately to move on without stopping. But the tingling wouldn't stop. It moved from his legs to around his shoulders. Everywhere he scratched, the creepy feeling would move until finally he stopped walking to take his makeshift harness off. Tearing away at his clothes, Duran felt the first bite, and it sent a shockwave of pain through his body. He screamed into the forest, hoping that someone, anyone, heard him and could help him. But there was no one. And by the time the second bite came, Duran was already curled over in pain. By the time the pain stopped, Duran von Spring stopped breathing. And once the townspeople heard of his demise, many blamed the wealthy man and his employees for Duran's death. And from the stories many of them told, it sounded like they blamed themselves as well. All of the workers said the place was haunted, from the tree he chopped down all the way to the richest man's sawmill. And there may have been a hint of truth to that, as a series of accidents plagued the worker and the company until it shut down. And the prettiest woman Duran ever saw had been cheating on the wealthiest man and left him soon after the money stopped rolling in. But she'd met with her own misfortunes. Every single person who ever had a hand in getting Duran von Spring into those mountains to chop down those trees met with an unfortunate fate. And it continued for generations to come, until one day, the accidents stopped. Present day, Terry and Jane had been driving for hours, looking for a spot on a map that Jane was sure didn't exist. The piece of paper looked ancient enough with its tattered edges, faded yellow face, with its simple black lines and numbers. She rolled her eyes, puffed out exaggerated deep breaths, trying desperately to get Terry's attention, but he was focused on the road and not on the temper tantrum she was attempting. "How much longer until we get there?" Jane whined. Terry glanced over toward her, giving her his signature crooked smile. His lovable big blue eyes narrowed onto her, and she slumped in her seat, giving up before he had anything to say. He told her they were going to be driving for at least 6 hours. She didn't realize how long 6 hours was in a car, so she popped in her headphones, turned up her own music, and fell asleep for the rest of the way. By the time Jane woke up, the car had stopped. They weren't at a gas station or even a rest stop, and Terry told her they were going camping, and that there was a surprise he wanted to show her. But she didn't think it was an actual in-the-woods camping. She thought it would be one of those fun kind of wilderness resorts where they could rent a cabin and talk to other people and enjoy each other's company without being solely each other's company. But once she saw Terry walking back towards the car with the biggest smile on his face, she couldn't help but feel at ease. She'd loved him for a very long time, and over the last year, even more so. And as she thought that, she thought also an engagement ring was coming. When he suggested this trip, surprise included, she just knew it was for a proposal. So she tried her best to keep her meaner side to herself and actually enjoy the trip. Getting out of the car, Jane stretched and smiled as he led her away from the parking space. There was room for other cars, but no one else was there. He led her to a small wooden cabin. Jane's heart skipped a beat, but when Terry opened the door, it was clearly a ranger station. It was one large room, with large windows on every wall, 2 desks, a radio, and a fridge in one corner next to a very small sink and a hot plate. There was one officer sitting at the desk reading a newspaper, while a woman, in uniform, gathered things from off some shelves. She spread them out on her desk and explained to them everything they needed to know. "So, you've rented these 2 hand radios here. Our frequency is 168.1000. It's already set, but if you 2 want to have a private chatter, just find a clear channel to set both on, but we'll set it back so you can reach us if necessary. Here's the GPS tracker, 2 military-grade LED flashlights, and a much better map than that raggedy one you showed me. Your permit is here, and the other ranger outpost is circled right here on the map. It's about a 2-hour hike to where you're going, but we can ride you out there if you have a lot of equipment." Terry glanced over to Jane, who was desperately trying to keep the smile on her face, and opted for taking a ride. A 2-hour hike was only about 20 minutes on a quad as the rangers drove the couple out to a clearing where most campers and hikers like to rest. It was more than halfway, but where Terry wanted to go, and they had to do the rest on foot. The ranger stopped before she sped off. "Good luck, guys, and stay away from that old sawmill. It's closed off, but some hikers thought it'd be nice to break in and get a picture or 2. They've paid for trespassing with a few broken bones from falls and falling debris. The ground ain't steady up there. Make sure you check in at least once a day. Tell us your coordinates of where you decided to pitch using that tracker. You get 48 hours of non-communication before we come looking for you. Good luck. Have a wonderful time in our park." There was something unsettling for Jane as they stood out there amongst the trees, watching the Rangers head closer to civilization and their car. Terry roped and bundled their packs together, and gathered the rest of their gear into a small sled, and began to head deeper into the forest. Jane's pulse raced the more she thought of them being alone out in the middle of nowhere. Her phone was barely getting a signal, and all she wanted to do was turn back around and go home. Once they reached the site, the first thing Terry did was build their fire. The only thing he told Jane to do was to head around the area collecting branches and anything else they could burn to keep the fire going. The sound of her legs slapping through leaves was all she could hear, but the deeper into the woods she got, the less she heard herself, and the more she heard the creatures of the wild. Something was huffing, growling, or snarling in the distance. Not wanting to take any chances, Jane grabbed what she could and hauled ass back to the campsite. She was sweating and out of breath, but Terry was as cool as a cucumber when he stepped outside of the tent. It was huge. In all the pictures he showed her of his trips, he was always in a small tent. You'd have to get down to your hands and knees just to get into it. This one, however, was huge by comparison. You only had to duck your head to get inside, and when she did, it looked like a bedroom. There was an air mattress, thick and firm. It practically came up to her knees as she sat down on it. The bed had sheets and a blanket. Her bags and stuff were on one side, while Terry kept a shotgun and the flashlights on his. The smile on her face couldn't be wider as she finally relaxed and saw how much trouble he'd went through just to get her there, and to make her comfortable. She was certain that now, more than ever, an engagement was definitely on their itinerary. But first things first, after all the traveling they did and working so hard to set up their camp area, they needed sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, a dragging, and a deep breathing, and more dragging, and it repeated for a little time. The noise came from right outside the tent, and Jane shot up from her sleeping bag. Terry wasn't beside her, and panic began to wash over her. She called out to him, expecting to hear some monstrous bear in return, but all she got was his smiling face poking into the tent. "Oh, good, you're awake. Come on, the stars are out and dinner's almost ready." There was a chill in the air as Jane looked around the tent. There were drag marks on her side, but she told herself that that was just her imagination, or it was probably Terry moving their chairs closer to the fire. She had to calm herself down. Her body was tense, and this wasn't as fun as Terry hyped it up to be. Sitting in front of the fire, they ate their food. She watched as Terry put everything away meticulously, making sure to hoist the food scraps into the air and out of reach of bears and any other hungry animal. He swore up and down that they only had to worry about frisky squirrels, but Jane knew better. They decided to play a few card games before heading back inside the tent for the rest of the night. More dragging, deep breathing, and Jane jolted out of her sleep once again. The fire outside the tent was out, and she couldn't see anything through the tarp. Shaking Terry awake, she wondered what was out there and if they should start the fire back up. He told her the only way to keep the fire burning all night was if someone was out there to watch it. It was warm inside the tent, so he didn't feel the need. Just as he calmed her down, they tried to go back to sleep. but she heard it again. This time, she was practically hysterical. Jane wouldn't go back to sleep until Terry got himself dressed and went out to have a look. A few minutes later, he returned to the tent with an aggravated look on his face. There was nothing out there. By the time Jane went back to sleep, she'd only gotten about 3 hours before Terry was waking her up to go hiking. They were going to his surprise. Jane tried to get excited, but there was doom lingering in her gut. As it turned out, she was right. They stopped in front of a rickety old wooden fence. A big yellow sign with black letters was affixed to it. Caution. The next sign they walked by was orange with black letters. Danger. "What are we doing here, Terry?" Jane asked with worry coating every inch of her voice. "Just come on," he urged. "We'll be in and out, I swear." Jane could feel the tears welling up in her eyes, as she knew they weren't supposed to be there. The old sawmill was off limits, as rustic and charming as it looked in the fall with the changing color leaves accentuating its rust coating. She knew they weren't safe. It wasn't just what the rangers said. It was with every fiber in her body. She knew that they had to leave. Jane was hesitant. Terry had to pull her toward the sliver of an opening in the fence. There was a large platform where Jane assumed milled boards would go after being cut. The sound of running water was nearby. But for the most part, there were only birds and bugs around. And they heard it again, that dragging, stopping, and breathing, and it repeated. And that time, well, Terry heard it too, as he glanced around them. Jane's eyes grew wide with fear as she suddenly felt the tingling sensation of something crawling on her. Shaking and screaming, she flailed her arms about, hoping to get whatever was crawling on her off. Terry told her to calm down as he set up his tattered old map, his phone, and pulled Jane to the center of the platform. Getting down on one knee, he began to speak, but Jane couldn't hear him. All she heard was the dragging and the breathing. Terror reigned over every emotion as she pulled her hands out of his and covered her ears. "Don't you hear that?" she yelled to Terry as the dragging noise got louder and louder. "Yeah, but that's nothing. There's no one out here but us," Terry told her as he pulled her into him. Lifting her chin so their eyes could meet, he finally saw how scared she truly was. "Oh, I'm so sorry about this, Jane. I thought that it would make a great engagement story to tell your friends and family. I found that old sawmill Grandpa was always talking about, to have it as the backdrop of our engagement photo. I just thought it was brilliant. But you're too scared, and I don't want this to be part of the memory for you." Jane shook her head. "He didn't tell you those stories because he was proud. He tells those stories because this place scared him." She buried her face into his chest. They turned around to leave, but the sliver in the fence was gone. They both ran to where they knew it was, but nothing was there. They tried to peel away the boards of the rickety fence, but it wasn't so rickety anymore. And they heard it again, the dragging and the breathing. The sound was louder than anything either of them could bear. It was all-consuming as they wrapped their arms around each other, finally seeing the image of what was making that sound. The wisp of air moved around it like a breeze carrying leaves. The dragging sound of the log behind him was the only thing they could see clearly. And as the apparition moved closer, the spine-chilling sensation of bugs and spiders crawling all over them magnified. With their hearts in their throats, Terry fished around for the hand radio. He yelled into it, but no one responded. With nothing else left to do, they took off running. Jane's body trembled with every step she took, and the dragging, and the breathing. And the ghostly man dragging the log behind him trekked slowly toward them. Jane let out a blood-curdling scream as she sank her nails into Terry's arm, and the ghost reached out to them slowly, but then, as his gruesomely blistered fingers nearly touched them, his entire face elongated as his mouth opened, and a horrifying scream emerged. Terry and Jane were literally frozen in fear. It was a sad day when the Rangers finally came to rescue them 3 days later, their eyes wide with fear, Terry with his arm wrapped around Jane, protecting her. Terry and Jane loved each other for the rest of their afterlives. They were joined at the hip from the moment they took their last breaths together, and for all eternity.